Hello, everyone. I'm suspending a number of questions. They'll be pertinent for next week, a week from today, in favor of one that was asked of me, and it went a little bit like this. Today I'm going to talk more Anglican, I should say, so hold on. So here it is. Person contacts me and said, we have gotten a new priest, but he refers to himself as a pastor, and he tells us that he wants to be called Pastor John. I have never heard this in my life, and I wondered if you would respond to it. Well, I thought that was a good enough question, but of course, like all good questions, there's no easy answer. So let's get started. And once again, as I said, this is Anglican. And so for those of you, when I say Anglican, I mean that's our communion. There are other names for it. It's called Episcopal. Some places it's called, in Japan, it's Nippon Seikokai, which means Holy Catholic Church. So, whatever it's called around the world, part of the Anglican family. So let's just put it that way, part of the Anglican family. Here goes. It's very, very clear in the scriptures, and then it becomes increasingly clear in the early days of the church, that what emerged were three orders of ministry. In the ordinals that we have, it even states that rather clearly in the books of common prayer. We have bishops, we have priests, and we have deacons. The various orders, bishops, priests, and deacons, also have various offices that they hold. So that, for instance, an archbishop and a pope are still bishops. So that means that you can't be more than a bishop in the sense that you may have additional responsibilities that you're given, but as it relates to the actual order of bishop, when bishops all gather together, they acknowledge and respect those who are called to, let us say, superior positions, like an archbishop, a primate, etc. Now let's go to priest. A priest is a priest is a priest. Some people prefer using the word presbyter. I don't, because I think that's a more difficult word to understand. And then we go to the order of deacon. Deacon, obviously you know about from the Bible, and you remember that the very first martyr, which we would call proto-martyr, was a deacon, namely Stephen. Now within each of those three, we can have various additional responsibilities. With the bishop, I've already told you, archbishop, primate, etc. With priest, in the Eastern rites, you hear about archpriests. Are they more than a priest? Well, only in terms of some element of honorific title, but also they get to vest a little bit differently, but they're still a priest. And in some communions, archdeacon. An archdeacon used to only be a deacon. Today, in more modern church history, they might be a priest, but an archdeacon, depending upon the part of the globe that you're from, is not more than the deacon, but he does have some authority that's been given to him by virtue of a gift of office or the responsibility that goes with it. But it's not an additional order. So we only have three orders: bishops, priests, and deacons. We do not have Anglican bishops, Anglican priests, and Anglican deacons. What we have is one priesthood, as it were, but what we have is, in the one Holy Catholic and Apostolic Church, we have bishops, priests, and deacons. If I were to say that I'm an Anglican bishop, I would be demonstrating that I believe that Anglicanism has its own type of bishop. Or if I said I were an Anglican priest, I would be saying that it's a unique form of priesthood. It's not. It all comes from Jesus Christ, bishop, priest, and deacon. It would be more accurate, even though lengthy, for me to say that I am a bishop of the one holy Catholic and Apostolic Church serving in Anglicanism. I mean, that would be an accurate way of doing it. And if you go back and look at some of the earlier comments of archbishops of Canterbury, they wanted to make it very clear to us that we had no sacraments of our own and no orders of our own, but that which has been given to us and entrusted with us in the one holy Catholic and Apostolic Church. Now, I recognize that there actually are some Anglicans who think there was no church until the English Reformation, and a few of them actually, the Protestant Reformation. But the English Reformation, as I think if you do a little additional reading, will teach you, there's a difference between the way it was done in England and the way it was done in other parts of Europe. And therefore, there have always been those in the British Isles, and that's my heritage, half of my heritage, that have seen themselves simply as heirs to the faith of the one holy Catholic and Apostolic Church that was introduced to the British Isles and all that area, depending upon which version you want to look at. If you want to look at the Glastonbury legend, then you say, well, when Joseph of Arimathea showed up. And then if you went to Glastonbury today, you wouldn't find him, but you would find something called the bush that he would have thrust into the ground, and out of his staff is the bush. If you go to Glastonbury today, watch out for the New Agers who will knock you over while you're trying to pray. Now, if we believe in the later idea of the Romans simply coming in with it, and when they made their earlier visits to the British Isles, yeah, you're in solid ground. And some will actually go so far as to say, yeah, but it didn't make any sense until we had the first Archbishop of Canterbury. And that's when the Bishop of Rome, Gregory, sent Augustine to Canterbury. Okay, well, I mean, you're ignoring a lot of history here, but I guess we'll go with that. There was already a great deal of Christian history going on, and many saints of the British Isles. Okay, and there would be some who would say, no, wait a minute. It didn't really make sense until we had the Council of Whitby. And at that time, that's when the English church says, okay, let's not continue with the old way we do it. Let's go with Rite II. Let's go with the contemporary understanding of the Western Church as Rome has articulated it. Let's have the same days for Easter. Let's follow this way of doing things, etc., etc. And that, has history too. But to be able to say that there wasn't anything of value going on in the British Isles and the British churches until the 16th century misses out on some things. In fact, it actually uniquely goes against the grain of Henry VIII, who really didn't want as many changes as some people think he really wanted. Now, I'm not defending Henry VIII, by the way, but since we don't believe in Anglicanism and papal infallibility, I always have some creative conversations with Anglicans who hold up certain members of the Reformation period who lived a short period of time and worked a short period of time. I look at them and I say, if you don't believe in infallibility, why do you hold these reformers up as infallible? Put differently, something happened of value before they were born, and something of value happened after they died. No question about it. But there are some standards that we have to hold on to. In the course of however you view this Anglican tradition, bishops, priests, and deacons. And you may remember that Charles I died to a large extent. It's a very complicated story, but he died to a large extent because of what he wanted the church to be, what his view of the prayer book was, what his view of bishops, priests, and deacons were. And Archbishop Laud, Archbishop of Canterbury, who was the Archbishop of Canterbury primarily during Charles I's time. And I don't think anybody here would really celebrate the years between Charles I's martyrdom and Charles II as having great church history, because not only did the church pretty much have to go underground, at least the style that we understood, but many of our people were persecuted. and the destruction of so many things that took place in Scotland and England and Ireland and Wales. I mean, nobody can rejoice in that. In the name of religion, that kind of destruction? I don't think so. But we also came out of that with certain understandings. At some point, the clergy became styled with the honorific title of the Reverend. And they were given within their categories of 3 orders, the Reverend, different types. For example, bishops were generally styled the Right Reverend. Archbishops would typically be styled the Most Reverend. Priests would be the Reverend, and deacons would usually be the Reverend. But we would never call them Reverend Jones. I mean, if John Jones is an attorney, he is the Honorable John Jones when he becomes a judge. But nobody ever walks up and says, "Hello, Honorable Jones." He is the Honorable John Jones, judge, and he is referred to it depending upon where you live in a variety of ways. Your Honor, perhaps, or Judge Jones. So you would never go up to a bishop and call him Reverend Jones, nor to a priest and call him Reverend Jones, nor to a deacon and call him Reverend Jones. It's simply grammatically incorrect. Now, if you want a little rundown on that, even Emily Post teaches us that, where she shows how the term Reverend was never meant to be an adjective. It's part of a longer title. It's like when I'm in England and I'm working with baronesses and barons and nobility over there in a variety of endeavors. When somebody is introduced as the Right Honorable, they don't go up to him and say, "Hello, Right," or "Hello, Honorable." It's not the way it works. So people in this country oftentimes have been confused by the difference between titles that are in the long name versus the form of address. So you may have the title, but that doesn't mean it's the form of address. Let's take it to another step. You will notice, for example, in England, one of the things that confuses people is that you may have your physician over there and you will say, "Hello, Dr. Jones." Dr. Jones then says, "I have to bring in the surgeon." Whoa, you say, that's a step up. Surgeon's coming in, and he says, "Hello, this is Mr. Smith." So you see, in England, the term Mr. has a high priority in certain professions. It's not seen as a lesser term the way it is in our culture. In our culture, Mr., Mrs., Ms., those are all kind of here, but somebody up here, "Oh, judge, oh, attorney, oh, your honor," whatever. No. You see, the term Mr. simply has gone through some changes over the ages. And that's the reason why it's never been grammatically incorrect for the Reverend John Jones in England to be called Mr. Jones. It's not pushing him down into some sort of non-sacramental way. It really, quite the contrary, is the same way that it's been handled with surgeons. Well, let's take that to another level if we could. In England, for example, there are responsibilities and therefore there are titles which go with being a bishop, priest, and a deacon. There are only 2 terms that are inclusive and include the 3 orders of ministry. Capital M minister, if we pray for all ministers with a capital M, that's bishops, priests, and deacons. We don't pray with small m minister because we have 3 types of ministers, bishop, priest, and deacon. And if we just say our minister, which we don't do in Anglicanism, or at least not historically, then the question was, what do you mean? If you mean that's synonymous with priest, sorry, it simply isn't. Capital M minister refers to bishops, priests, and deacons. Another word that is inclusive is the word clergy. The word clergy. Because bishops, priests, and deacons are all clergy, no matter what they're doing in their particular ministry. Now, at the same time, you recognize in England that when you use the term parish, you're talking about a particular area. The same is true with a rector. Let's say you walked into a community traditionally and you found 6 churches. One church in that community would be called the parish church, and the rest would be churches. The parish church has a rector, even if there's a smaller congregation within the church. And by the way, we don't call people congregants, we call them parishioners. I've heard that lately. Where's that coming from? And so a congregation is simply referring to a group who happened to congregate at that time. It doesn't refer to the whole parish. The whole parish has parishioners. So now we go back to what we mean there when we have a rector who has this authority. He also has to be the record keeper. Let me give you an example. When I went to Llanelli, which is near Swansea in Wales, where my grandparents are from, and I went to the church there, which means it's St. Eli. It was the parish church, but there were several other churches there. One was purely Welsh-speaking. The one where my grandparents were was both English and Welsh. Another one over here is just English. Here's the vicar, but there's the rector, the parish church, which is St. Eli, because the name of the community is Llanelli or St. Eli's. So, what does that mean? Well, a rector has additional responsibility, but doesn't have anything to do with size. So if I went to most churches and I said I want a meeting with just the rectors, I would be excluding lots of other clergy. In other words, I wouldn't be allowing vicars, I wouldn't be allowing curates. So we have to be very careful and not use that kind of language. So let's go to the next one. What are these vicars doing? Well, what's the word vicar? Vicarious. Vicarious. That means they're serving vicariously for the rector. In this country, that means the rector is the priest who's in charge of a self-sustaining church, not dependent upon the diocese, for assistance financially. It also means that the people have the privilege of being able to elect their priest. Missions in this country have vicars. The vicar serves vicariously, though, for the bishop, because the bishop is technically the rector of all missions. A mission is a church that is dependent upon the diocese for financial assistance to be sustainable. It also means that the bishop has the prerogative to name who he wants to have in his missions because they function vicariously for him. That's the reason why in parishes we have vestries. In cathedrals we have cathedral chapters, because the bishop is able to sit in on all those meetings along with the dean, who is the rector of the cathedral. But at churches that are dependent upon the diocese and the bishop, which are called missions, they don't have vestries. They have something called bishops' committees. And that's because the bishop of the diocese has the prerogative to determine who he wants to represent him there in addition to the priest, namely his bishop's warden, which would be in a parish called a senior warden. Now that I've confused you totally, let's keep on walking. By the way, I'm sorry, this is all Anglican, so let's move ahead. If you go back and you look into the books of common prayer and in the canons of the church, you'll see a word that is simply not in there except in a particular way, and that's the word pastor. In our tradition, we don't have pastors. At least we don't have them in the way in which they're used in non-Anglican churches today. So let's see what we mean by that. If you look in the New Testament, you will discover that there are varieties of gifts but the same Spirit, and not everybody is called to be a pastor. So to use the term pastor as a term to mean bishops, priests, and deacons is inaccurate. It simply is inaccurate. And there's a reason for that. In the consecration ceremony, the bishop is made clearly stated in our books of common prayer, chief priest and pastor, chief pastor. True, pastor is a shepherd, oversees. When you see the word pastoral, when you look at pictures and you have pastoral, that's referring to a really, really nice view. And you know that the bishop demonstrates his pastoral responsibility by the shepherd's staff. It's also the reason why green is the color associated with bishops along with purple. And very odd that you don't see bishops using the color green. Actually, the bishop's throne is supposed to have a lot of green around it, not purple, because it demonstrates the fact that the original color for the bishop was green as a pastor, shepherd. And later on, during the Constantinian period, when we had the Holy Roman Empire, bishops were invited into the royal family and were therefore given the royal color. Now, when I'm teaching, I don't wear that purple cassock because that's only when I'm celebrating, when I'm doing sacraments. This is the kind of cassock that a bishop wears when he's teaching or when he's presiding over a meeting. So we have different types of cassocks with different names. So what's the next step that I would want to look at with you? Well, certainly when the Protestant Reformation occurred, many denominations determined that they wouldn't have bishops, priests, and deacons anymore. One whole branch decided that their member of the clergy would be all three. He'd be a bishop, priest, deacon. And so in many traditions, they went with the word pastor. So the word pastor for them meant we don't need to have a bishop, we don't need to have a deacon, because the man we have in charge of our parish does it all. He's the pastor. One other form of Reformation point of view was, well, we don't want bishops, but I'll tell you what, we'll get all the elders together. And what's an elder? Well, if you go back in the Bible, this is where you get into the fun of, is an elder, since the Greek word presbyter is the elder a priest? Well, there was no intention of these churches to be able to have an elder who was a priest. In many places, it became sort of a group of elders within the congregation who were held up and became a part of a board of elders, just like board of deacons. But what happens in those situations, generally, it's a term of office. It's not an order. It's a term of office. So somebody may say, I served on the board of deacons for a while, now I'm off. Well, they're not a deacon anymore. Or I served on the board of elders, but then I rotated off. I'm not an elder anymore. So we have to be very, very careful that we not be imprecise in our language in Anglicanism, because I think we're starting to adopt traditions that are not part of our tradition. Let's take it a step further. I read something by an Anglican the other day who said he was speaking with a group of pastors. Well, I felt really sad about that, because that meant that there were academic people who were clergy who weren't able to be there. It also meant that there were people in very specialized ministries in the church who weren't there because they're not serving as pastors. So the word pastor does not refer to all ordained people. Never has, never will, and it's certainly not that way in the Bible. Moreover, in Anglicanism, we don't have executive pastors. I don't know what that means. We don't have senior pastors. We don't have junior pastors, and we don't have lead pastors. That's just not part of our tradition. Now, I don't have a problem with it being part of other people's traditions. I think it can be helpful. But we have an obligation, I think, to teach people the peculiarities of our expression of faith, rather than to let it all blend together and just be a part of the culture. Now, words change, and I get that. I understand that. For example, you and I, when we're using correct English, will certainly say something like, I talked with a doctor today, so when they come to see me, what? They? Oh, two are coming? Well, no. Well, what does the word they mean? I thought that meant more than one person. Well, no, I just didn't want to say him or her. I didn't want to have to assign male or female. Well, but what you are assigning is numerous. So if you tell me that I need to see a doctor, but they are coming to see me today, should I put out 2 cups of tea or just 1 cup of tea? Well, you and I know that that's not what's minded, and there was no formal change that was advertised, any more than when many of us, if somebody said, what is the sex of that child, would say male or female, without any notice, it suddenly became gender, which is very helpful when you're in the field of botany, but now it's come to mean something else. Did somebody vote on that? No, I mean, it just sort of emerged. Now, am I here to argue the merits of those 2 examples? No, not at all. Nor am I here to say that if a man walks up to me and says, I'm Bishop Jones, and I say, oh, it's so good to meet you, and he says, yes, I'm at the congregation of the First Assembly, and so therefore I realize that this man is not in the order of bishop, because they have a minister or they have one order. I'm not going to call him anything other than Bishop Jones, because that's what he asked me to call him. Likewise, if a man walks up to me and says, even though it says that I'm Richard Jones, my friends all call me Dickie. Well, okay, am I your friend? Tell me what you want me to call you. I'd rather you call me Dickie. Okay, Dickie. Now, that may be difficult to roll off my tongue, especially if the man's 90 years old, but I'm going to do it because that's what he asked to be called. So we have common courtesies here today that we have to understand in a complex society. Try and respect what somebody wants to be called. That doesn't mean you agree or that they are in your mind. What's in your mind, if you impose it on another person, is not very charitable, is it? But let's go back to the presenting issue in our churches. If I can assume that today I have to have lots of information before I go to the Verizon dealer, like I'm going to do today, and I better name everything that's working and isn't working so that we can cut to the chase and get this resolved, I will understand that this person is requiring of me technical language that I've had to learn. And I'm willing to do it. But why is it in the church today that there are people who say, oh, I'm a church planter, I'm going to go in there, and I'm the minister and the pastor, and these are my congregants, and Reverend Smith is coming tomorrow. Why? Where'd that come from? Do we assume that everybody in which we come in contact is somewhat on the low side of understanding? Well, I mean to say, I don't think so. Moreover, I have an obligation to learn technical terms today if I want to navigate life. I mean, I don't know about you, but I sure have a hard time keeping track of all my usernames and passwords. But if I say to the various companies that I refuse to use usernames and passwords, I have no access. And they say, tough luck, we don't care. The church has gone the other extreme. And that is, I believe, what we're doing is we're discrediting people and not giving them an opportunity to enter into centuries old traditions that we are privileged and pleased to be able to offer. Example, let's go back to the rector business. Do we call somebody Rector Jones? Not really. I mean, occasionally in England they'll say the rector, or do we use the term vicar? Do you call your priest Vicar Jones? Well, in England they'll sometimes say the vicar, but that's because they're accustomed to the fact that that's the title that goes with this particular order of ministry. But please, one more time, let's run through this. Not every one of the three orders, not all bishops, not all priests, and not all deacons are actually pastors. But they are all clergy, and they are all capital M ministers. So let's get into the next term. I found it amazing the other day, somebody wrote me and said they are now the curate. And I looked and I saw it was a layperson, but now in modern language today, mind you, I was told 10 years ago that nobody in the world would understand what the word curate is anymore. But now it's become a very common term in a variety of secular institutions. Well, where were we? They expect us to now adopt that, but we were all along saying a curate is the priest who is involved in the cure of souls, the cure of souls. And if you look at our books of common prayer, you'll see how many times the term curate is used, particularly in the English books of common prayer, because the word curate referred to those who had the cure of souls. And so what we're doing today, many of our churches, I'm afraid, are adopting titles and terms that don't reflect our heritage. And I'm not sure what heritage they're really representing. I really don't. So let's move on a little bit ahead. Back to the woman's question. If a new priest, part of Anglican tradition, goes into a parish and announces that you're not allowed to call me father, because call no man father, and I don't like reverend or mister, so you can call me Pastor John. I mean, that's what he wants to be called. I guess that's what he's called. But is that a part of our tradition? Sorry, it's not. It's an innovation, in our tradition at least. So what about, though, the fact that this person has come into a setting and is determined he's going to change it simply because it matches his need a little bit better? This is where teaching and explanations need to be done. Another one now is, hi, I'm your new priest, just call me John. Well, you know, everybody can call him John, his mother, his father, his friends, his brothers, his sisters. But the question will be, what is it that your people need you to be? Do they just need you to be good old buddy John? Or do they need you to be here, particularly when you're needed? It's like clergy who aren't wearing clerical attire. I mean, my goodness gracious. If you look at all the major professions, if you look at firefighters and you look at policemen and so on, if you're in trouble, don't you know that that's somebody you can go to? You don't go up to a man standing over in the corner next to a fire hydrant who's wearing a shirt and a tie or jeans and a t-shirt and say, you must be a fireman. So what's wrong with us having something distinctive so that people will be able to talk with us about something on their mind? It's like priests who say when they ride an airplane, fly in an airplane, that they never wear clerical color. Why? Well, they don't want to get in a conversation. Really? I mean, don't you think now's the time for us to be in conversations with people to talk about their faith? Do we have to always have people guessing what we are? Or they say, gee, he had a religious sound to him. Nice to meet another layperson who talks religion. I mean, wouldn't it be good for them to walk away and say, whoa, you know, I spoke with that man. I didn't really like priests, but after talking to him, I really understand why he's serving Jesus the way he is. Folks, this is a golden opportunity for us to get out of this generic world in which we now find ourselves, where everybody gets lumped together. Now, let's go back one more time to another principle. Well, you can't call me father because the Bible says call no man father. Well, you know, I've always liked that one. I especially liked it one day when an historian said that to me, and I said to him, so what do you call George Washington? You don't call him the father of our sorry. And what about that man who's married to your mother? You call him up. Sorry. But another time, it was a member of a Masonic order who told me that. And I said to him, do you see the other words in there we're not supposed to call people? No, Donald says, no, call him father. I said, well, let's pull it out and look and see what else it says. And I said, now tell me, you're in the Masonic order. I don't know much about it, but I'd like to be educated. What are you? He said, well, I'm a Master Mason. I said, oh my goodness, you just broke it. Can't call anybody that. So let's be really honest here, folks. If we have decided to call somebody something or something of ourselves, let's go through the list. Is it part of our heritage, part of our tradition? Good always to start there. Or are we borrowing from other churches? Well, at least say it. Or the culture, you know, like executive pastor? Really? I mean, you can find all those offices within any secular organization. Or call no man father, but our priest likes to go by doctor. Really? Not all priests have a doctor's degree. Doesn't that separate him from the rest of the clergy? Isn't it true that most of us were brought up in an environment where we were more interested in our family relationship, our spiritual father? In religious orders, brother and sister? I mean, really, folks, it's not just the Southern Baptists who go around and say, hey, brother, hey, sister. We've been using those familiar terms, the terms that reflect our family, for a long time. Our prayer book even says it about bishops. Reverend Father in God. I mean, it's very clear what our intention is here. We live in a family, and all of us are subservient to the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit. So be respectful. If somebody else tells you that they want to be called such and such, even if it's not part of our tradition, be respectful and understanding. But if any clergy are watching this, don't shortchange the people by letting them think that we have no history, that we're part of the current situation. Our clergy don't live in manses. Our clergy don't live in parsonages. Our clergy live in rectories and vicarages. So if some priest lives in a rectory, wouldn't we assume he's a rector? And if a priest lives in a vicarage, wouldn't we assume he's a vicar? And if this sounds a little bit funny to you, when I was a curate, that is an assisting priest in a large parish, the residence I lived in was called the curacy. Now, do we have pastor used? Yes. In cathedrals, we have a canon pastor. What's a canon pastor? A canon is somebody, there's several types, but in the cathedral setting, who is one of the assistants. Most assistants became known as canons. And the particular canon who is in charge of pastoral care, but under the authority of the dean, well, he's called a canon pastor. And so we have used the title, but we've used it for a specific purpose and time, so that if the canon pastor eventually becomes the dean of the cathedral, he is no longer canon pastor, but he is the dean. And he will have a canon pastor, and he'll probably have a canon precentor, which is the musician, and all the other sorts of canonries that we have had over the years. And so it's time for us to become as knowledgeable in church titles as we are with Apple and with PCs. If you know all the titles for PCs and Macs, and you don't know all the titles in the church, take time out and be able to read them. Numerous things have been written about them. And let's not fall into the trap. And here's the final point that is really problematic. And that is what I would like to call an anti-Catholic bias. There, I've said it, an anti-Catholic bias. If you decide that you're using this term because you don't want to be confused with a Roman Catholic, you have to ask yourself the question, do you need to be healed of your bias and prejudice? See, I do. I have to be healed of my prejudices. I was brought up near almost at 74 years old, where ethnic groups and others oftentimes were looked down upon. And that's what I heard. But I didn't change the system to match me. I had to change me so that I would have a greater appreciation of the fact that I had some prejudices inside of me. And if they linger, I have to offer them up to God. And I would say the same to us here. If you don't want to be called Father because that's what Roman Catholic priests are called, you can be healed. If you don't like using the word rector or vicar because you think it's too English and you like the word pastor, please understand that you can be healed. All of my prejudices, all of my biases, and all the ways that I have looked down upon people over the years because they weren't like me, I confess in the confessional to Almighty God. That's what we can do. So take all your biases and your prejudices and your preconceived notions today and put them in a box and give them up to Jesus. And the absolute final point is this one. Do all that you do in absolute charity and love. You don't have to reject your past. If you were, for example, a Protestant minister who came into Anglicanism and you want to forget your past, don't do it, because there were some people working among there under the authority of Jesus who helped shape you to make the person that you are. Do not reject your previous life in the church simply because you are now in Anglicanism. And those who've come out of the Roman Catholic tradition, for example, or Eastern Orthodoxy and come into Anglicanism, I've got to say the same thing to you. You need to understand that you don't have to reject what you were because of the fact that you were nurtured in those traditions. If you had a tough time or there was a problem, you can be healed. But don't act as if nothing of any value happened in your life until you came here. Because Jesus, the same Lord, was working there. And let me say then, on a similar note, if you came into Anglicanism, don't do the disservice to people of letting them think that nothing of any value happened until the 16th century. Not only is that arrogant, but it also denies what Jesus Christ, by the power of the Holy Spirit, was doing long before the 16th century. I know it's a tough one, and I know some people are probably upset about this, but it's okay. This is meant to be thought-provoking, and I just use it as a measurement for us to look against. And what I've offered you, the best of my ability, has been objectively what I've read, studied, and learned by the books, by the tradition, and as an observer of the culture in which we find ourselves today. Don't curse the culture, but don't become so compromised that you always have to give in to it. Thank you, and may God bless you.